I'm a geneticist, plant breeder, and crop physiologist, kind of all in one. You have to have all those sciences together. And I've been at New Hampshire for quite a while. And when we work with winter squash, one of the things we have to look at is nutrition. Because when you breed new varieties, you want them to have a lot of nutrition. There's a lot more emphasis on nutrition now. And so, what comes to mind when discussing nutrition? All of these things virtually: caloric intake, vitamins, minerals, improved digestive function, dietary fiber. We know that's very important. And a lot of people are looking for these miracle cures from plant and animal extracts, and there's a lot of stuff being sold, you know, on the internet that probably most of it isn't very good for you, but there's a lot of it being sold. When it comes to winter squash, which by the way, in most countries would be called pumpkin. Squash is an American term, okay? We have 3 different species of squash, and they're quite different in their nutrient composition, or can be different. And I'm going to be mainly talking about these 2 species, Maxim and Moschata. And this we would call a kabocha squash, whereas a buttercup would have that blossom end scar on it. And most of what you see in the grocery store, we now call kabocha squash. They look more like that. That's actually one of my varieties. And then butternut, I think you're all familiar with butternut. And that Cucurbita moschata is a tropical species, okay, where the other 2 species are more temperate. And the nutritional components of squash that I'll talk about are the reserve carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are compounds which contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, CHO we call them. And sugars and starch are the major components actually in squash when you harvest them. The carotenoids are fat-soluble orange and yellow pigments, and I'll talk a lot about those because those are key nutrients that squash provide, and they provide it in a unique way. Dietary fiber, then soluble dietary fiber is just cellulose, the cell wall material, and the soluble dietary fiber would be pectins. And then there's other vitamins, and what's called ash are just all the mineral elements. Magnesium, calcium, phosphorus, and so forth are the ash part. And this particular slide, I actually adapted it from some work by Dr. T.J. Phillips, who was part of the New Hampshire Agricultural Experiment Station back in the 1940s. He was in the Department of Biochemistry. And if you look at this data, and what I did is I just combined the data from butternut and buttercup together to give you kind of an overview. And you can see when you harvest a squash, 62 to 68% of the tissue that you eat, which we call the mesocarp, that much of it is comprised of storage carbohydrates in the form mostly of starch, but also quite a bit of sugar. Well, those 2 components are important for the eating quality of the squash. And you notice after, and I rather point to these than use the pointer, but you see after 3 months of storage that the starch component goes down and the sugar goes up. And how many of you have stored squash? And you know that when you store it, it gets sweeter, right? And that's because the starch gets converted to sugar. And this is the cell wall component stays about the same in storage. The percent cell wall component goes up a little bit just because you lose a certain amount of starch and sugar to respiration. The protein estimates are high because of the analytical procedures they used back then, and actually up through the 1980s were not good. And then the mineral elements, usually they come in, that's a little high figure, usually it's 3 to 4%. Why is starch important? Well, as I mentioned, starch is the storehouse for sugars. So the starch, when the leaves have photosynthesis, they transport the sugars to the storage organ, which is the fruit of the squash, and stored as starch, and then the starch is subsequently broken down. So the sugars are an energy source for the fruit for respiration, and they also increase the palatability of the squash. So you have to have a certain amount of sugar in that squash or it doesn't taste good. I mean, you could eat a squash like you eat potatoes, but most people like a squash that's sweet. Starch provides the acceptable textural properties. Starch, when you have water and starch together, it gelatinizes, okay? It absorbs the moisture and it gives a pasty texture to the squash. And so when squash has been in storage too long, then it tends to become watery and fibrous because you don't have enough starch to get that nice pasty texture. And actually, if you get a squash like a kabocha squash, which can be a real dry squash, in other words, it has a really lot of starch, it actually is not too edible because it's got too much starch and not enough sugar, and so it appears very dry and difficult to eat. And I have a lot of students that work in my seed lab, and we, during the fall, we go through hundreds of samples of squash, and we do taste tests and test them for sugar content and so forth. And these are what the samples look like when we cook them. And you can see from these samples the carotenoid levels visibly. You can look at the carotenoids, the color of the squash, and you can select for high carotenoid levels, just visibly, okay? We don't have to have any sophisticated instrumentation just to get the levels up. In percent dry weight we take in soluble solids because they're indirect measures of sugar and starch. And we know from studies elsewhere and in our lab that if you increase the sugar content, which is measured by soluble solids, you actually increase the acceptability of the squash. And we know that a lot of our squash we have to store in order to get those sugar levels up. Why are the carotenoids important? This is the main message I want to say, is beta carotene and alpha carotene, which are major carotenoids, okay, in squash, they are converted to vitamin A, okay? And so 6 to 12 units of beta carotene, which is the main, one of the main carotenoids in squash, 6 to 10 units of beta carotene, by the time it's digested and everything, equals 1 unit of vitamin A. And vitamin A is important in growth and development and also eye function. But squash is unique among the storage vegetables compared to, say, sweet potato or even carrots, in that it not only has beta carotene, which is a source of vitamin A, it also has lutein, and some species have a little bit of this zeaxanthin, and they are pigments that are in the back of the eye, the macular region of the eye, and these pigments offer photoprotection against the light and also affect the vision as well. And there's indications as you age, they can, if you eat a lot of these carotenoids, they can retard macular degeneration. The other thing I want to emphasize is most of the early data, and the USDA has constantly updates their data on the nutrition of the different fruits and vegetables, but the data on the carotenoids has been in error for years and years and years, because when we can separate the carotenoids out using high performance liquid chromatography, and we get these peaks, and you see that there's two carotenoids here, and the size of the peak represents how much is in that tissue, and these two carotenoids don't have any benefits to humans. So we're trying to select for strains of squash that have a lot of this peak, which happens to be beta carotene, and a lot of this peak, which happens to be lutein, which is a beneficial carotenoid, and this peak is zeaxanthin, which is the other pigment that's in the eye. So we can, using the more advanced instrumentation, we can actually select for squash strains that are more nutritionally beneficial. And just to give you a rough idea, acorn squash don't have the high levels of carotenoids as kabocha and butternut, and you can see the recommended daily allowance. You don't get a whole lot from eating this. This is based on 100 grams, or about a 4-ounce sample of squash of an acorn squash or kabocha or butternut would give you the required amount of beta carotene to equal enough vitamin A to be sufficient. And you can see that kabocha squash, if you eat 4 ounces of kabocha squash, which is just a decent serving size, okay, about that big, that would give you anywhere from 36 to 72% of your recommended daily allowance that's needed for an adult. Okay, lutein, they don't have any recommended daily allowances, but you can see lutein is very high in kabocha squash and butternut squash, so they're very nutritious vegetables. And I'm not going to go into this, but of course squash has all these different elements and so forth, and really a pretty good source of phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. And I put down the seeds too, because you can consume the seeds in squash and pumpkin, and they're also sources of important elements. So,
any of them new squash have any taste on?
What of the? Well, those don't affect the taste.
No.
Like all those vitamins you see, they're in microgram amounts and even what we call picogram amounts, in other words, 1/1000th of a gram. And so those don't affect the taste. Okay, there's other aromatic components that we actually haven't studied that affect the taste, but really the balance in starch and sugar is the overriding, those are the overriding contribution nutrients in squash that affect taste more than anything else, okay? But not the vitamins and minerals. They don't have too much effect on the actual taste of the squash. That's why we concentrate on those other ones. And the same thing in vitamins. Of course, the squash does contain vitamin C and many of these other vitamins in moderate amounts, okay? It wouldn't satisfy your nutrient requirement for those vitamins. You'd have to get those from other food sources. And I want to acknowledge this research was supported by the New Hampshire Agriculture Experiment Station, and these are just some of the research technicians and graduate students that have helped out on this particular project. This past year I had 5 different students working in my seed lab, and so they get a lot of experience in assisting. And so, questions?
So what you didn't present today, maybe we actually have a little bit of slack time now. Talk about some of the new varieties. How many new varieties have you introduced over the last 10 or 20 years?
Well, variety development has been a major emphasis of my research, and right now I'm working with 8 different seed companies, and I cooperate them, and just I would say in the last 20 years we've have 50 new varieties, or 50 to 60 new varieties are out in the seed industry we've developed. Now a lot of those are melons, some of them ornamental pumpkins. Squash varieties, actually the biggest sellers actually are some of the ornamental varieties. I mean, but we have, this past year we have a couple new squash varieties that are out. High Morning Organic Seeds has 2 new of our squash varieties, and there's different seeds. There's a lot of smaller seed companies in the Northeast that develop varieties with local adaptation, and so we work with these companies. We also work with companies outside our state. We work with a company in New Zealand and a company in Colorado and a few smaller companies in California, but mostly in the Northeast. And like Johnny Selected Seeds, High Morning Organic Seeds, Roop Seeds in Ohio, Seneca Vegetable Research in New York. Those are some major seed companies we work with. And we developed these varieties, and the seed company produces these. And again, we're trying to upgrade the nutrition, but we look at other things. Disease resistance is really an important factor we look at, and palatability on the squash. And so it's
Save the seeds from anything now?
if they're a hybrid variety and you save the seeds, you get a lot of different things from it. And if you save the seeds of squash or pumpkin varieties, you have to control the pollination. By that I mean you have to close the flowers off and prevent the bees from pollinating, because they're cross-pollinated. So saving the seed of the species I work with is a little bit more difficult than like peas and beans. You can save the seed, and what you save, you'll get the progeny will look like the parent plants, but not in squash, because
So you're screwing with Mother Nature then, right?
yes, definitely, yes. That all the agriculture varieties we have are not. I mean, they originally came from Mother Nature, but no longer. You know, yeah.
And for something like squash, Native Americans have been selecting on those for thousands of years.
Yeah, that's a good point. All the species of squash come from our hemisphere. The kabocha squash actually originally from South America, Cucurbita machata originally from probably Colombia and Ecuador, and then the acorns from Mexico and North America. Yeah, and all the Native Americans in both continents selected for varieties as early as 10,000 years ago. Yeah, long time.
So my question is, like the old Native American varieties versus this, there's a significant difference in the nutrition?
Well, probably both nutrition and quality. You know, particularly for things like the carotenoids. The carotenoids are much higher in my varieties. Even the current butternut variety is a little low in carotenoids, and what we're selecting in our, because we're breeding that type of squash, we're getting the carotenoid levels up about double what they are in some of the present varieties.
And my second question is, the pollinators, I watched something for more of an ornamental squash, and they had moths that were pollinating.
No, actually, it depends on the species of squash, but actually there's a particular squash bee that evolved with squash in Mexico, and that bee has migrated to North America. And we actually, at home at least, we have a particular soil type where the bees can live. They're solitary bees. So there are squash bees that pollinate squash, but by far the best pollinator of squash are bumblebees. They're the most efficient of carrying the pollen, and they're also very, fortunately those have stayed very abundant, whereas our honeybee populations, which is a European species, that has tended to gone down. It fluctuates, okay, but yeah, bumblebees probably the most effective pollinators for numerous species. You know, you probably see them in your yard and everything. They're very efficient pollinators.
The other ones are brown bears.
Well, we're going to hear in about another 15 minutes. You're going to hear a lot about native pollen.
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Yes.
Looks like one of the hardships of working with you is that you have to eat a lot of the product, right?
I eat a lot of squash, and the strain it's very good for you. It's good for your digestive system, and I eat a lot of squash, and it's amazing that my skin doesn't change color. No, seriously, I eat a lot of squash and also melon, but anyway, squash from September through into January. I'm eating squash every day in my seed lab, because I taste every sample that comes out of my seed lab.
Folks in your lab, they do a taste sampling, you do a taste sampling. Now when you decide to release a variety, you go out and do more taste sampling?
All the varieties that are released have been sampled by seed companies. I send hundreds of samples. experimental samples out to seed companies, and they probably don't pay attention to the quality in the same degree as I do, but they do sample.